Hello and welcome to my talk, The Story of Mrs. Crocombe's Cookbook, brought to you exclusively by our first ever Members Week. English Heritage would like to thank you very much for your continued support. My name is Cathy Hipperson and I'm a historical interpreter and the face of Mrs. Crocombe on English Heritage's YouTube series. And I'm here at Audley End House in the historic kitchens to talk to you more about Mrs. Crocombe and in particular about her cookbook and how it's come about. The book I'm speaking of is this one just here. For those of you who have been on any of English Heritage's social media or websites, anything digital, you'll know about this. You'll probably have seen it before. It was released in September. But what I'd like to do is to give the story of how it's come about. And it has really come about because of Mrs. Crocombe working in this very kitchen. This kitchen and the cook are integral to this book. So to start this story, we need to look at Mrs. Crocombe herself. To be honest, Mrs. Crocombe is a very typical Victorian of her class. And she is all of these things. She was all of these things. She was a farmer's daughter, born in Cornwall. She was a Victorian servant, of which there were thousands and thousands, particularly women. She was a cook here at Audley End House. This, cooking for Lord Braybrooke, is one of the unusual things that are part of her life. And then once she retired and got married, she became a boarding house owner. She is a very, very typical Victorian of her class. And those of you who have tried to research your family, you will understand that if you do have a very typical lower class Victorian family member, you're not going to find much about them. Oh, unless they've committed murder, or if they've married someone who's committed murder, or invented something amazing, or done something amazing. But otherwise, if they are just a normal person, you're not going to find much about them at all. In fact, we know very little about Mrs. Crocombe because she wasn't a renowned cook, and she wasn't famous in the Victorian times. We don't even know for sure if this picture is her and her husband. Very little is known about her. But like I said, for those of you who have done some research into your own family, there is one place that you can get information. One place where people are recorded, no matter who they are or what their status is. And that is the census. So let's have a look at Avis Crocombe's census entries. The census is the year ending in 1, so actually we're in a census year this year. Avis's first is in 1841 when she's 4 years old and she's living with her very typical farming lower class family, her parents Richard and Agnes. Agnes is Richard's second wife. With his first wife, he has 7 children. With Agnes, he has 7 children, and 7 of those younger children are living with Avis in 1841. So she has step-brothers and sisters who are much older and have established their own households and have their own careers. And it's with one of these that in 1851 she is working. Her older brother, John. She's left school probably at 10, for that's when the leaving age was, and at 13 she is one of the general servants in his household. For most girls in this age, that's what you did. You became a servant, and once you were a servant, you stayed in the general household that you started with, perhaps moved to another, but you didn't move too far. Avis, while she is a typical Victorian of her lower class, actually does make one of the unusual steps of moving to London. And so in 1861, she has sought her first step, major step in her career. She's moved to London to become a kitchen maid. And she's a kitchen maid for a Liberal politician, John Townshend, 3rd Viscount Sidney, who was actually the Lord Chamberlain for Queen Victoria. So it's quite a well-to-do household. And she has a scullery maid to help her. It's quite a significant step to leave Martinhoe, to come to London, although she isn't unique. there are quite a number of female servants doing it, although generally not many venture further than the general servant in a smaller household. She's definitely on her career path. And we can see this when we move into 1871, where she's now cook and housekeeper to Sir Thomas Proctor Beauchamp, and he has a family home in Norfolk. He would also have a home in London, which is possibly where she applied for the job. But there she's moved on considerably in her career, for she is cook and housekeeper. No small challenge, no matter how small the house. And Langley Hall is quite significant. It is now a boarding school. It's just outside Norwich. She has 2 laundry maids, 3 kitchen maids, and 3 housemaids under her command. So she must have been quite a good manager, someone to look up to. But the most significant year in her census, certainly for my story and actually for my life, is 1881, because she is here at Audley End House, although actually that's not quite true. At census time, in May, she wasn't here. She was in Lord and Lady Braybrooke's London home, which is in Upper Brook Street. There she is with all the other servants based at that house. But there are no cooks or kitchen staff at Audley End House, so we can assume, rightly, that she would have travelled with the family from London to Audley End House, to this kitchen, whenever the family did as well. So we have an idea now, this is very significant for the work I do, of who is here and who worked for Lord and Lady Braybrooke. This is also quite a significant step in her career, because Lord Braybrooke is a baron, and a baron wouldn't normally have a woman cooking for him. So she's made quite an achievement. Despite being a very ordinary Victorian lower-class woman, this is quite a significant step for her. It would normally be a man cooking here, and for anyone higher ranking than Lord Braybrooke, you'd expect possibly even a Frenchman being in the kitchen. So she must have been a remarkable cook to be able to get this job. However, she is remarkable, but no one actually remarks on her. There's nothing written down. No one comments on her cooking, on her ability to manage. Nothing is mentioned at all, really, apart from her name listed here in the census. The census isn't the only place you might find a record of a lower-class typical Victorian servant if you can find their marriage certificate. And here we have, in 1884, Avis Crocombe gives up her life here, working for Lord Braybrooke, and she marries Benjamin Stride. He is a butler for the Throckmorton family, who have a property, Cofton Court, in Warwickshire. They also have a London home just round the corner from Lord Braybrooke's London home, and perhaps that is how they met. Either way, he, a widower with 3 children, and Avis get married, and very sensible, because of their age, they are 45 and 46, they set up a boarding house, something less physical, perhaps even less demanding than the role of a cook and a butler. So they set up home, and that is where you will find her in the next of our census entries, running a boarding house in Paddington. Now, Paddington is near Hyde Park. It's quite a well-to-do area. You can hope that they do quite well in their industry. And so they do until, well, if it's not a marriage certificate, it's a death certificate that people are mentioned in. And sadly, Benjamin dies in 1894. They were married for 10 years. He does, however, leave her just under £500, which in modern terms is about £63,000. So he does leave her fairly comfortable enough for her to continue her trade. And so for the next few census entries, you find her at the boarding house. The difference is she has a servant of her own, so she has perhaps raised her class slightly, and she has Benjamin's youngest daughter, her stepdaughter, working with her. And she stays there until just before, we think, 1921, when she retires, and she goes to live in Marylebone. Then, sadly, in 1927, she dies of bronchitis. but she is 89. And I think we can safely admit that she has lived a very full and a successful life. She is married later in life. She has found security for herself. And during her career, she was incredibly successful as someone like her can be. She couldn't really have gone anywhere further than working in a kitchen for a baron. But saying all of that, she is still a pretty typical lower class servant, of which not much is known about her. And yet, how can this, for this literally is all that we have about her, how can this person in 2021 not only have a cookbook, not only be the subject of a talk here in Audley End House, she's even got her own Wikipedia page. How can this come about? Well, I think really there are 3 reasons that this has come about. The first one stems here, exactly in this spot where I'm stood, and started in 2008. And that is the fabric of where we're standing, the service wing here, the historic kitchen, the historic laundry, and the historic dairy. In 2008, the project to reinterpret these spaces back to the year 1881 was completed. English Heritage spent a great deal of money and an awful lot of time researching where things would have gone and how it would have looked. Naturally, there are elements of these spaces that were changed and could not be changed back. But for the most part, when you step in here, you are stepping into Avis Crocombe's kitchen of 1881. The same with the laundry and the same with the dairy. This project, this redevelopment project, or rather restoration project, continued over the years and has stretched to the nursery within the household and then the historic stables. So it was a large project, started here in the service wing, and it was also the journey of this cookbook. The interpretation was not just about the fabric, it was also about the people who worked here. So using the census from 1881, the historians started to dig into the characters that worked here, the servants that worked here. And so we have the cook, and we have her 2 kitchen maids, Mary Ann and Sylvia, and her scullery maid, Annie. And when you're working as a historical interpreter, what you're doing is working really to set parameters. Here in the kitchens, what we wanted to interpret was the story of the building, of how it was used and what it would have felt like in 1881. We wanted to tell the story of the house and the family who lived here. We wanted to tell the story of the characters that we portray, even though very little technically is known about them. And one way of doing that, and the project at the time was headed up by Annie Gray, food historian, was to look at the food. And so whilst you were here as a visitor, if you met us, you would also get the opportunity to see us cooking. So we wanted, as a team, to encapsulate, to bring in all those elements. And that's really what live interpretation is about, live historical interpretation. It's about taking on a character, and even if you don't know much about that character personally, you want to educate, you want to give the impression of that person's life. So we talk about life here in Victorian England, not just here, but in the country. We try to behave and emulate the lives of those servants, what it was like to work here, what it was like to live here. And Mrs. Crocombe and her maids would have slept in the rooms above here. We had to learn what we could about Mrs. Crocombe, and a lot of the time we have to second guess what is going on. But now, 12 years into our 13th year later, we are still here in costume when we can, when we're allowed, when it's open, and we are portraying these characters and we are cooking. And we don't always finish the dishes. We are restricted by what we can do here. So really the food doesn't act as a how to cook, it acts as a how to teach you history. So we'll choose dishes to unpack the time. Often we'll cook curry to explain how curry was very popular. The Queen is the Empress of India and spices were readily available. We'll cook different dishes to show that we're cooking for a lord and a lady, and we'll also then show you dishes that the servants will cook. Again, we might not finish them because it's quite challenging to cook in this space, particularly when it's crowded and there are visitors here asking us questions, delaying our work. but we want to use the ingredients and the process of cooking to help the visitors understand and experience what life was like. And that's really important to us here in producing this live historical interpretation project. And actually, there's only one other place where food is cooked live in front of the public in a historic context, and that's the kitchens at Hampton Court Palace. So it's a really unique project. It was a brave project to do in this kitchen in 2008, and thankfully it is still going, hopefully, when we open today. It was really, really important for us to maintain this even last summer when we attempted to do it by keeping apart from each other under social distancing. But what this photograph does also remind us is that the project, the Historical Interpretation Project, is now beyond the kitchens in the same way as the Fabric Interpretation Project of the buildings extended. We now have a character in the stables, and often you'll find Mr. Vert in the gardens, the historic gardens, talking about the history there as well. So this project has grown and is developed, and I have been part of it for all of those 12 years. So it's a really important part of my life. This is a really important part of our story also, but the next integral step was the finding of this. And this is Mrs. Crocombe's manuscript notebook. All cooks of Mrs. Crocombe's standing, from 1881 right up to modern day, would have notebooks. And they would write notes to themselves, they would write shortened versions of recipes, they might find recipes they've seen written down somewhere and thought that might be nice to develop. They might write down recipes that no matter how often they cook it, they can never quite remember the amounts. It's their personal notebook. And this is hers, and in 2009, it was given to English Heritage by Bob Stride. And this is Bob Stride. His grandfather was Mr. Stride, Benjamin Stride's nephew. So he is related, sort of, to Mrs. Crocombe, but definitely related to Mr. Stride. And through chance and the way things in families get moved around from different families down through the years, he had in his attic this notebook. It didn't mean quite so much to him. It does say in the front, Mrs. Crocombe, cook at Audley End House, but I don't think at the time when he found it he'd ever been here. But he did come on a visit, and while he was here, he realised the name was familiar, and then, well, the rest is history. He got in touch with English Heritage, and they sent, I think, a very polite, a very measured response to say, yes, please, we'd like it. Thankfully, when he arrived here to hand it over, I was in costume. For if I hadn't have been, my behaviour wouldn't have been measured. I probably would have flung my arms around him. This was, for me, the most exciting thing. For now I was going to get to see a character who I'd played for a year and I'd really embraced. I was going to set something that belonged to her. And it's very rare to get a typical lower-class servant's book, her writing, her actual handwriting. I'd been writing as her for over a year, and now I was going to actually get to see it. I was I was beside myself. I was pretty much in tears when I met him. And then later, when we had our photo shoot, I think he was probably taken a bit unawares. He probably thought I was quite mad. However, the book has been so incredibly exciting for myself and for Annie Gray. For inside, there are a number of different recipes that we could then look at, transcribe, and realise that actually we were cooking very similar recipes already before this arrived, but now we were cooking real recipes that she would have cooked here in this kitchen. That is almost unique. Unbelievable. It's quite a challenge to describe it, and not all of them are very nice. And as you go on in time, the book, the handwriting does change. Probably written by her stepdaughter, perhaps. We don't know. But it is, however, Mrs. Crocombe's notebook, and it's incredibly, incredibly exciting. The next big thing in our story is this, the YouTube series, The Victorian Way. Now, like everything that I've talked about so far, it started off quite small. The history of the Victorian Way, and I'm assuming you've had a chance to look at it because you've been in lockdown for a year, and no doubt there have been a mention of Mrs. Crocombe once or twice in the many emails you've received from English Heritage. But it was never this successful at the beginning. It actually started not here in this kitchen, but in another beautiful Victorian kitchen. And if you get a chance to go and see it, you really, really must. And that's the one at Brodsworth Hall. I was doing a Christmas event, not as Mrs. Crocombe, as the cook based there, and I was making a Christmas pudding. A photographer came along and he said, very casually, "I've got a video camera, shall we make a film of it?" I can say this very flamboyantly because that said gentleman is actually standing behind the camera as I speak. And this gentleman made a little film of me cooking the ingredients. We had to be very careful because I'd only taken enough for one go, and we didn't even finish it. It didn't even get cooked. We just mixed it. But goodness me, once it was on the YouTube channel, it was so popular. And so when they decided to refurbish their YouTube channel, English Heritage looked at their most popular videos, and my little short snippet of me mixing was one of the most popular. So I was approached to ask if I would play Mrs. Crocombe here, and I did so on the understanding that that gentleman who had dragged me into this was here too. And so Johnny has been here throughout the Victorian way and is now ably assisted by David, who is also standing over there. You can't see him, but they're here. And he does wonders with the sound in this room, which is very echoey. And so together, the three of us, and with a few others, have formed the Victorian Way. And now there are 55 videos as part of this YouTube series. It has won awards, and I like to think very proud of it. I do find the whole thing quite mad that it's taken off, and it's made me think about why. And I think the reasons are is people like food. Food things are always really popular. People like history, particularly servants' history, no matter how ordinary and unknown they are. And, well, just people like videos that are fun. And I think we've managed to encapsulate all of those things. Plus, we are cooking real historic recipes. And I think that just really intrigued people and it drew them in. And before long, our numbers were increasing and increasing. Not necessarily here. The most popular country of viewers was America, aged between 25 and 35-year-old ladies. They were the ones who were liking it. South America and Asia, very popular also. It took a few years for the videos and the series to get popular in England, and some of that might have been promoted by the fact that the ice cream video outdid in its views one of Jamie Oliver's, and so there was a big push and a publicity and celebration of that. Anyway, you now, in England, are enjoying the Victorian Way. The Victorian Way is much more now than just me standing in here at the end of this table in my costume, cooking historic recipes. Now it's got so popular, it started in 2015. Dr. Annie Gray, food historian, is here to script and to make sure we keep everything on track, but other characters have joined us. The most popular video is actually the butter making video filmed in the dairy, but we've also had a gardener and we've had Mrs. Warwick, the housekeeper. But the series also involves other elements of life here at Audley End that can be under the heading of the Victorian Way, and my favourite is actually this one, which is where our stable manager is driving a little cart with Milo, beautiful little pony. Nevertheless, it is the community who watch the videos who've made it so popular. And as those numbers have increased to millions, they like to interact. And I think that's one of the joys of YouTube, is that you can interact, you can leave messages. And there are quite a lot of them. They really like the series, they find it very fun. And here are one or two of the messages, including ones that show that it's fun. And they're quite fun back. So this one says, right, let me grab my pigeon breasts, as if everyone has pigeon breasts in their freezer. A lot of people find them very comforting. And then educational, which was one of our important remits, and addictive. And then the final comment I'd like to add here is someone who says, green food colouring what in capital letters? And this is one of the interesting things, is that when we put these videos out, it's the elements that people pick up on. And for a long time now, people have really struggled to understand that Victorians had food colouring, and chemical food colouring at that. Obviously, food colouring, naturally made, has been around since medieval times, but the fact that Mrs. Crocombe in this kitchen in 1881 could buy food colouring has, in some cases, blown people's minds. Suet is the other thing that people struggle with, but then we have to remember that a lot of our audience are in America, and suet is very difficult to get hold of. A lot of people don't even know what suet is. So despite the fact that generally these are made in the winter, and the three of us here, and Annie and other members of the team, are freezing, and sometimes I'm so cold I can barely feel my fingers, this has become incredibly popular. And it's the drive from this, really, along with the other elements, that have created a book for the YouTube series. So how do you do that? How do you encapsulate everything that we have brought to the series, that we have brought to the live project here? It needs to be educational, it needs to have real recipes, it needs to incorporate all the hard work done here, and it needs to stick within the historical context. Well, first of all, you might as well then start with Mrs. Crocombe's manuscript book. And that in itself was quite a challenge because her handwriting is quite difficult. So each of these recipes in the book needed to be transcribed. Now, as I mentioned, we had done a few of those to begin with. Annie had taken them away and had tried to read Mrs. Crocombe's handwriting and then had used what she could with her knowledge, she's a great food historian, to try and work out how they were actually made. And we had 12 of those that we would cook on a regular basis here in the kitchens. But this book was going to give us the opportunity to transcribe all of them, not just the few that we'd taken a fancy to. And that, for me, was really, really exciting, to really get to understand what exactly was in the book. We needed then to do something with these transcriptions, and so some professionals, we have Annie Gray there, 2 chefs, Ian and Miranda, professional chefs, proper cooks, not someone just doing her best in her own kitchen or in the historic kitchen here at Audley End House, took these recipes and have made them into a recipe that you can follow and you can achieve at home. They were a little bit influenced in trying to make them look like something that would appeal to the modern eye, rather than keeping them historically accurate, but they have created some beautiful recipes and some beautiful dishes. Annie wanted to make this book something that you could cook from, something that you could create a Victorian meal from, should you wish to. And so, if you see Annie's talk on Victorian dining, we needed a lot of different courses and a lot of different kind of recipes. Mrs. Crocombe's cookbook is mostly biscuits and cake. There is a handful of meat dishes, and there are only 3 vegetable dishes that I can find. There's potato with almond as a pudding, there is broad beans, and there is preserved lettuce that really just needs to be avoided. And so in order to create a Victorian meal, Annie was going to have to add lots of different kinds of recipes. One of the benefits of there being money available for the manuscript cookbook to be transcribed and for the chefs to spend 6 months developing those recipes was that we also were available to get an intern from York University. And she meticulously went through all of Mrs. Crocombe's recipes to find out where she'd got them from. Many of them we already knew had come from Eliza Acton, but it gave us an insight to some of the other recipe books that she would have used. Using this information and some other commonly available Victorian recipe books of the time, Annie Gray has put together recipes so you can, in fact, design your own Victorian meal. And so there's some quite well-known ones from the cookbook, including mock turtle soup, which is very famous from the Victorian age. And there is a Christmas cake recipe in here, but it isn't Mrs. Crocombe's. It is actually Francatelli's. So not all the recipes in here are from the manuscript book, but please don't feel that that time and effort transcribing the book has gone to waste. For right at the very, very back, we have here the transcription in full. And along with that are notes, not just about the recipe itself, but also how the chefs got on making the recipe, and some of them do indeed say, this is not worth your while. It's interesting, some notes also from the intern of where these recipes may originally have come from. So there's all the pages at the back of Mrs. Crocombe's manuscript cookbook transcribed for you to read. So you'll get a chance to have a look at her sometimes appalling spelling and her lack of any use of commas or full stops. As I transcribed some of the recipes, that was quite challenging. So we have the beginnings of a cookbook taking shape, but it was going to be more than a cookbook. It was going to be more than a collection of recipes. It was also going to be the kind of coffee table book that you might have at home. And so for that, we needed one more person to join the team, and that was a food stylist, Sophie Wright. And here she is with a very large turbot. You might recognise the turbot kettle on the front of the cookbook. With Annie, she managed to make all of the dishes that they included in the recipe book, even some of the marmalade dishes, which is what they've got there, look beautiful. It was quite an epic photo shoot, and it was perhaps the most time-consuming element, the most exciting element of producing the book. Here in the kitchen, we have lots of equipment for photo shoots for the cooking of food, but the presenting and serving of food was quite difficult. So Annie and Sophie spent a long time sourcing all the different props that you see appearing within the cookbook. It is, then, a very, very beautiful book. As I say, the photo shoot was quite a dramatic day, and Annie can be quite persuasive. So all of the chefs, Sophie included, were eventually persuaded to dress up as one of the maids in the kitchen, and Ian there as perhaps a gamekeeper with his ever-loyal black Labrador. If you have watched any of the other English Heritage videos, you might recognise the Labrador as the scary hound from the Wronged Woman video. That is my black Labrador, Bess. So, the last element of the book, and what I think makes it more than a cookbook, more than a coffee table book, is the history element of it. They're not just recipes, and they're not just beautiful photographs. There are also, within the book, huge chunks of Andrew Hahn's research. And Andrew Hahn is the head of the historians here at English Heritage, and he has written much of his research. Not only the research needed for the redevelopment of the service wing, but also the history of the house. It's a really, really educational read. And I'm really pleased that they decided to make that history element an integral part of the cookbook as well. And so how well has it been received? It's been out since September. It has sold just under 7,000 copies for a book like that. It's very successful. And here I have on just my Instagram feed some of the comments of those who have really enjoyed receiving this book. They have cooked from it. This gentleman here in the middle, he is a very talented cook, having followed him, and he does love his historical recipes, so he has made a very grand dish there with eggs. They have tried cooking from it, they have enjoyed it, and we have had some amazing reviews back. You only have to check out Amazon to see how popular and how successful it has been. And how far has it gone? Well, this gentleman here is from Malaysia. Then we have a gentleman here from the Czech Republic, followed by two ladies, one from Canada and another one from America. And these are just a tiny amount of those who've got in touch with me personally. English Heritage have been inundated with praise for this beautiful book because it is very beautiful and it's got some great history amongst it. It's travelled all the way around the world. And so really, that brings us to the end of the story of Mrs. Crocombe's cookbook. However, like all elements of history, it isn't really the true story. Whenever you study history, there are always many layers, and what you first thought isn't always necessarily right. This kitchen, when we're in here cooking, the first thing that people say often when they come through the door, if they've never been here before, is, oh, it's just like Downton Abbey. And actually, when we are in here cooking, I suppose in a way it is very like Downton Abbey, except it isn't, because this is much earlier than Downton Abbey, and Downton Abbey's kitchen is set in a house for someone far grander than Lord Braybrooke, and most importantly, Downton Abbey isn't real, it's fictional. Here, you have the real history that you can witness and take part in. It's the same really with the story of Mrs. Crocombe's cookbook, because the cookbook actually isn't Mrs. Crocombe's. She didn't write it. She didn't really have anything to do with it. She also actually, if we're going to be pedantic, wasn't ever Mrs. Crocombe. The title Mrs. was given to her when she became the cook and the housekeeper to give her more status. She was Mrs. Stride or Miss Crocombe. And then last of all, I would say it isn't a cookbook. It's much more than that. It's a history book, it's a coffee table book, it's a recipe book. It's not just a cookbook. History is strange. History has many layers. History is intriguing and exciting, and I think that's what this book here certainly emulates. And that's what a visit here would emulate too. So I'm hoping that many of you sitting there at home, fed up with sitting at home, will return if you've been already, or certainly come and explore the kitchens. But most importantly, myself and English Heritage would like to thank you through these difficult times for continuing to support us. But before I go, there have been a number of questions that have been sent in by yourselves, some of the members. Let me have a look. How did cooks manage to plan and cook meals for both upstairs and downstairs? Did they delegate the planning and cooking of staff meals to a deputy, or did they really have to do it all themselves? What sort of meals did the servants have? And that's from Vivian. That's a really good question, and a question that I think a lot of people forget. That Mrs. Crocombe would have been cooking for the family, and in 1881, that was 2 people, Lord and Lady Braybrook. If they had guests, she'd naturally been cooking for them. Their daughter, Augusta, had left home having got married. However, there were just under 30 servants, indoor servants, that she also would have cooked for every single day. As a rule, a house like this would have had 3 tables: the top table, the family table, the middle table where the more important servants like Mrs. Crocombe, Mrs. Warwick, the housekeeper, would have sat, and then the rest of the servants. Now, Mrs. Crocombe would have been in charge of cooking for the top table, keeping an eye over the higher servants' table, and then perhaps a general eye over the cooking of the lower servants. And her maids, Mary Ann and Sylvia, would have helped with the cooking of the rest. Mary Ann would have been in charge of cooking for the servants. So they would have delegated, but Mrs. Crocombe, with the help of either Mrs. Warwick or indeed Lady Braybrook herself, would have helped with the planning of the recipes, depending on what they had available. There's one here. What is one dish that you would try from the new cookbook and why? I've tried loads from the cookbook. What would I recommend? The plum pudding, the Christmas cake, definitely, nearly all of them actually. The apple hedgehog is a delight to cook, especially if you've got little ones. So I'm hoping that lots of people have made that over lockdown. I don't think I've come across one yet that I haven't liked. Is there anything you've learned about Mrs. Crocombe, be it a recipe or how she went about her days, that you've integrated into your own life? I don't wear a corset as a rule. I don't work in a big Victorian house. I would like to have servants that worked for me. I could do with a kitchen maid and a scullery maid, but I don't think so. I definitely cook more varied recipes because of Mrs. Crocombe and playing Mrs. Crocombe. I'm braver. I'm also brave at turning out jellies in front of the audience, which I would never normally do. So I suppose I'm braver with my cooking, but the rest of Mrs. Crocombe, being a Victorian servant, she can keep in the Victorian age. How did Mrs. Crocombe have a nice retirement? What did she do after leaving her job at the end, after all the end? Well, I've answered that, I think. She took up with Mr. Stride. They got married. Just take up with him. She married him. And they ran a boarding house. I don't know whether she ever thought she would retire in the same way as some people retire today, as in they sit down and enjoy their holidays and garden. That was never going to be an option for Mrs. Crocombe, even when she became Mrs. Stride, because she was a lower working class Victorian. She was always going to have to work. She did retire towards the end when physically she couldn't, but I don't think there was anything horrible. I think you like to think that if there was something awful, we would know about it. I'm sure she enjoyed it. On average, how long does it take for a scullery maid to be a head cook like Mrs. Crocombe? Actually, on average, very few girls did that whole trajectory of a career path. Most girls started as a scullery maid, maybe made it to kitchen maid, and then got married. So actually, she was unusual in that she continued the whole path. So, well, Mrs. Crocombe started when she was 13 and ended when she was about 45. I think that answers the question. You had to be pretty lucky to be able to move on, and very, very few women actually made to be a head cook in a house like this. And that brings me to the end of my talk, the story of Mrs. Crocombe's cookbook, but isn't really. And hopefully it's encouraged you, inspired you to come and visit Audley End House and explore the historic service wing once it's open, and the grounds and the house itself. And even if you've been, to come read the book and explore more of it with a better understanding of the fabric of the building. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all your support during this difficult time, and enjoy the rest of Members Week.